So yes, my name is Heather Flanagan. I am the current co-chair of the Federated Identity Community Group and the brand shiny new Federated Identity Working Group. And I do a whole lot in the digital identity space. So I won't get into all of that. If you're curious, go find me on LinkedIn. I'll be there. What I want to cover today is, I think several of the lightning talks that you just heard had a couple of key points about users and user data. And that's a great segue into what I want to talk about, which is, the fact that digital identity is so key to the web experience. So we're gonna talk a little bit about why it's so important. We're going to talk about what it is, who's working on it, what the W3C might do about it, and where things are going from here. What I'm really hoping that you get out of the session is that I want you to go away with an understanding of the landscape, a feeling that it's at least as interesting as I think it is, and that the W3C is the right place to be working on some of these problems. Okay, so not only did the previous talks, continually come back to user data and identifying users because of fraud or whatnot, but here's some numbers that you might think about. And that's that, 2/3 of the world's population currently has access to the internet. Why? Well, a lot of that is because they like to buy things, they like to do online transactions, and the whole global e-commerce space is looking at somewhere around, close to $6 trillion just last year. And that's only going to grow because there's over 26 million e-commerce sites in the world as of recently, and that's only getting to more and more every day. Now, what about how how do you actually think about identity in the market that supports all of that? Well, that market just by itself is expected to grow to $43 billion worth by 2029, which is such a small number when you look at what we expect to have happen in cybercrime, including identity theft and fraud, which is expected to grow to over 10.5 trillion in the next few years. So why does the W3C care? I was looking at the W3C's proposed vision statement, and I kind of summarized it into 4 points: accessibility, usability, security and privacy, and interoperability. That's a great vision for the W3C to have, and identity is a fundamental part of that, of being able to actually make that vision happen. To be more accessible to everyone, in part means being able to differentiate people and being able to identify what they need, having them be able to say, I need this particular experience in this particular scenario, right? All of this is part of the identity space that makes it relevant to what we're trying to accomplish. Now, of course, it being very important is great, but what is it? And that's a much harder question than you might think. If you ask 10 people that work in the identity landscape to define digital identity, you're probably going to get somewhere along the lines of 15 answers or more. One of the hats that I wear is I'm the executive director for a nonprofit called ID Pro. It's basically a trade organization for identity and access management practitioners. And we have a body of knowledge that the members have been working on since 2019. And one of the things that I require from every article is a terminology section. Tell me how you're using your terms. And this was one of the definitions: an attribute or set of attributes that uniquely describes a subject within a given context. That was my favorite definition for digital identity out of the ID Pro terminology document. But NIST 863-3, which is one of the foundational standards in the world, coming out of the U.S. National Institute of Standards and Technology, they focus on digital identity a little bit more broadly as, again, the unique representation of a subject engaged in an online transaction. This is good to know. One of the things that I've noticed as I scroll through all the different ways people have defined digital identity is there's a lot of confusion about what is an identity versus what is an identifier, because they're not actually the same thing. Identities almost get to the point of philosophy because it's like that collection of information about an entity, whereas the identifier actually starts to drill down into specific aspects of them. So something to keep in mind when you're thinking about what is digital identity. Are you coming at this from a perspective of the specific identifier that you want to work with, or are you coming at this from the perspective of the identity? For the sake of the W3C and today's conversation, I wanted to up-level that whole question about identities and identifiers a little bit, because I see the W3C as a little bit more, identifiers are a big component of it, but why? Why? Because it's about the best practice for the user experience. It's the individual's experience on the web and how that works, how that happens. So what we do here is we oversee those how people engage with websites, how websites collect consent for things like authentication and authorization, how to get individuals to the right identity, the right identifier that they want to use at any given website. And this is a subject that's actually growing nearer and dearer to my heart. So everything I've spoken about right now, and a lot of the examples we talk about identity on the web. And the first thing that comes to most people's mind is, well, that's then about a person. It's about a person's identity. In the digital identity landscape, non-human identities are an even bigger deal. I don't think that this is something that is quite as solid a fit in the W3C, that the W3C certainly needs to be aware of the fact that non-human identities exist and are used, because I just wrote a whole blog post on the fact that there is more and more websites are actually pulling data and information and sending data and information across several different cloud environments at the same time, and giving processes, devices, servers, having them be able to communicate the authorization information that's necessary from one cloud platform to the next, to the next, to the next, is not actually a solved problem. And so there is definitely work going on in that space. I want you to be aware of it, though it is probably a little bit out of scope for what the W3C needs to talk about, but I didn't want you to think I didn't know, or that you didn't need to know about it at all. So who's working on what? This was a fun picture put together by a friend of mine, Mike Pelage, as he was trying to capture all the different standards organizations and the major work that they were conducting that circles around that black hole that is digital identity. You can see the W3C is there as we work on WebAuthn, as we work on verifiable credentials, as we work on the Federated Credential Management API. All of that's in our wheelhouse, but the IETF is also working at a slightly different layer. They're working on OAuth for the authentication components. They're working on WMSI, which is coming back to like the workload non-human identity. They're working on SPICE, which is more focusing on the credentials that actually need to transfer from one source to the next, to the next, to the next. ISO is doing quite a bit of work, trust over IP. The point of this image is that the identity landscape is too big for any one standards organization to focus on. There are many standards organizations that all have a role to play in this. And our biggest trick will be to make sure that we are properly collaborating with the others and not reinventing wheels that have the expertise in another wheelhouse. one of the conversations that I'm having right now is with, for example, the OpenID Foundation, as they are working on one flavor of verifiable credentials. The IETF is working on another flavor of verifiable credentials. ISO is working on a flavor of verifiable credentials. This is an interesting space to watch. And it's not because we're doing it wrong. If you look at the underlying assumptions that are going into all of that work, we're all just circling a problem from different dimensions. And I think that's going to be ultimately healthier than some folks think. But it's not just about, okay, there's a lot of work that can be done in this space. There's a lot of work being done in this space. Some of it is a better fit for this standards organization than others. And you kind of then have to step back and say, okay, so there's a lot of work to do. A lot of it is about the user experience on the web. But at what point do we need to say, okay, we know we can do it, but should we? Just because you can do something doesn't mean you should. And here's why this has become hard. I know that digital identity is got some politics going on right now, where people are not necessarily convinced that we're going in the right direction. And what I'm seeing is difficulty in balancing the interests at play. Just as an example, there are privacy concerns about letting identity providers know who's asking on behalf of the user to log in. For the identity provider to actually track that relying party. Is that a privacy concern? Some people will say absolutely 100% yes, it is. And others will say, but that's a security feature because our identity providers are not going to talk to just any relying party. They are tightly configured such that we don't allow that to happen. So we have to know who's even asking the question. Both these things are true and accurate and valid. So the ethics of the questions of the privacy considerations are complicated. Another area where this touches in, as you start thinking, okay, you want to make the best user experience possible, how many either identity providers or digital wallets or identifiers, how many things do you actually need to present to an individual? Well, for the commercial web, there's not that many identity providers out there, really. There's maybe somewhere between 5 and 10 that really handle 80 or 90% of the use case. But if you go to another sector, then you're looking at thousands. The higher education sector around the world has somewhere between 5,000 and 6,000 identity providers that scholarly publishers have to connect to all of them because they won't necessarily know where an individual is coming in from. So what kind of user experience does that afford? And how much information do you have to share in order to get there from here? Browsers are going to have to support all of this in the most privacy-preserving fashion possible. But the questions of privacy, the questions of ethics, the questions of how much control do you give the users, how much do you protect the users? If it was easy, we would have figured it out already. It's not easy. We haven't figured it out, and I think that's why we're seeing some of the heavy politics that we are across the landscape today. I touched on this a little bit with the Galaxy slide. We do have standards that some people perceive as competing, and I think they are competing because they're coming from different underlying assumptions. So I'm going to point in this example to verifiable credentials, and I'm using that term in lowercase right now, not the actual W3C standard of verifiable credentials, but the generic term verifiable credentials. If you go to ISO, the ISO MDL standard, it has a verifiable credential, and it's based on a very, very structured concept of a driver's license. everything is built with that as the bones that were underlying the thing. Now they may try and make it a little bit more flexible going forward, but that's what it was originally for. And so anything that expands upon that still has that at its core, something very, very structured, very well-known fields, very, very internationally agreed upon as this is the thing and this is how it is used. But then there's other verifiable credentials, generic term, lowercase, that are designed to be flexible. They're designed to serve any number of different use cases. They're designed such that you can use them for transit cards, for concert tickets, for memberships, where a lot of that structured driver's license detailed information is simply not necessary. Neither of these things are wrong. They are both perfectly valid constructs. There's just different underlying assumptions. There's different requirements. There's different use cases in when you would use one or the other. So I think some of the competition that's at play shouldn't be there. I don't think it's actually necessary as long as we recognize that we're using these things for different reasons and different use cases. Something to think about. All right, I did zip through these a little bit faster than I think I was supposed to, but I'm hoping that leaves us time for a lot of discussion and questions. When it comes to the W3C's role, which is really what I wanted you to be thinking about through all of this as to why does this matter to the W3C? You know, we're in a landscape right now where we are holding as our vision the accessibility, usability, security, privacy, interoperability of the web. But that means we're balancing the standards that we write, the expectations of our users, and the regulations of various geopolitical entities around the world that are creating due guardrails for what can and cannot happen. So where we are, we're actually in the middle. We're in that overlap of all these things coming together. It makes our lives perhaps a little bit more challenging, a little bit more character building, but it is our reality. So enjoy that interesting intersection, because that's where we are. And this is to get you to start thinking a little bit about breakout topics. There will be a breakout session later today. And I wanted to suggest a few topics for you to cover where we could talk about, all right, so if we have all these different requirements, if we are looking at increasing regulation, if the user experience for different generations is, you know, that diverse, then what does the next 30 years look like for us? What are our challenges? What are our opportunities that fit in our scope of fostering the web? More specifically, like what exactly can the W3C do? You know, what I think we can do is I think we can foster some of the more common understandings, because no one understands the web as well as we do. And helping the other standards organizations that will be working over the web, who will be seeing their tools, their services, their features being used via a web platform, helping them understand what that means and what the users expect is what we're strongly positioned for. And so we might talk about that, and we might talk a little bit more about the different collaborative efforts that can be underway with other standards organizations, with regulators, with the stakeholders, the companies that are in the room that are members, that aren't members yet, and how to get them engaged, thinking about identity on the web and how we're going to innovate over the next 10, 15, 20, and 30 years.